Dear students, welcome to episode 3 of lecture 4, The Great Transformation, a Heuristic Concept. After we heard the 2 episodes from Professor Messner, we now have him here to answer a few questions on the content he presented. Welcome, Professor Messner.
Welcome also from my side.
Just as a starter, I've been wondering the whole time, you started your first lecture saying that there were 3 important transformations. The Neolithic revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and you presented to us today what you call the Great Transformation. Why is it then a transformation and not a revolution?
Yeah, from our perspective, actually, the Neolithic revolution and the Industrial Revolution have not been revolutions. It have been evolutionary processes. So there was no big movement which invented a new political or economic system, pushing forward a revolutionary process. It have been evolutionary processes in the context of the Neolithic revolution, a process which took several hundreds of years, and in the situation of the Industrial Revolution, many decades within Europe to bring up these industrial societies. So this has been evolutionary processes. The transformation we need now needs to be shaped, politically organized. This makes the big difference. And this is why we call this the process now transformational process, because we have to transform processes with political intentions.
Okay, thank you. It's interesting because in this transformation you talk about these things that have to be shaped, but you also talk about the things that are happening and around which you need to shape what you want to shape for the Great Transformation. And one of these that I wasn't completely clear on was this increasing middle class all over the world. Why is this an important factor in the Great Transformation?
There is a very positive trend. The positive trend is that many people in developing countries are becoming richer. This is wonderful and nice because this implies that poverty is going down. More people are now in a situation in which they can invest more in the education of their family, in the education of their children. So this is important and positive. On the other hand side, if we go business as usual with our consumption patterns and growth patterns, so if this kind of people, the new global middle class, is becoming richer in a way in which we became richer during the last 100 or 200 years, we are going to transport all these planetary boundaries we spoke about, and we are going to emit so many greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that we are going to see dangerous climate change. So now the challenge is having growth and having new middle classes, more wealthy people, but with much less resource consumption and much less greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, and does this link to this concept you mentioned about decoupling growth production? And
right. So decoupling implies that you do have growth, you do have wealth creation, but without the emissions and resource consumption patterns which we have been seeing before. So becoming richer with less energy, becoming richer with less resource consumption. This is what the decoupling concept is about. And what we need are not only relative decoupling processes, but absolute decoupling processes. What we have been seeing in many industrialized countries during the last 2 decades are efficiency gains, also in terms of carbon efficiency. But those are overcompensated by growth processes. So what we need in a situation in which many people are becoming richer is that many people are becoming richer, but we have to bring in absolute terms the emissions and the resource consumption patterns down.
Okay, but this also links to this concept you presented on stabilization of, you talked about this equilibrium, that there had to be an equilibrium between the total amount of carbon that was produced and world population. It's a bit confusing because you want to, it's not confusing, but it sounds very complex to decouple this production to carbon emissions, and then at the same time to think that you have this increasing amount of population who are going to consume more. So could you talk a bit more about this stabilization and equilibrium?
Yeah. Now I've been talking about the greenhouse gas budget, if you have in mind this greenhouse gas budget. And what we are bringing out in this study and in other studies is that if we accept the 2 degrees Celsius target, the existing budget is around 750 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions from now on to 2050. And within this budget, you need to have wealth creation for a global population which will grow from 7 billion today to 9 billion in 2050. So the situation is that we need this kind of decoupling, which we have been reflecting on before. So business as usual growth is no option. If you would like to stabilize, and we need to stabilize the ecosystems, and if you would like to avoid dangerous climate change, wealth creation in the future is only possible based on radical efficiency gains in terms of carbon efficiency and resource efficiency.
Okay, and about this carbon budget, it's a carbon budget for everybody in the world?
This is the global carbon budget.
Okay.
And then the question, or the next question, or an important question is how to distribute that.
Exactly.
This is a justice issue at the end of the day.
Okay.
I'm traveling a lot and I'm working a lot in developing countries. I'm a development economist and working on development strategies for developing countries. So these people are asking me, how are you going to distribute your 750 gigatons? Your countries have been growing during the last 250 years based on fossil fuels. You have been becoming rich based on this kind of growth pattern and consumption pattern, and now you are arguing that we can't do that. So we need to become rich, but without resources and without fossil fuels. How is this possible? And this question is absolutely right. So the question how to distribute the global greenhouse gas budget is not only an economical question. We have been talking about efficiency gains. It is also a justice issue.
And this justice issue is also something that you try to address through international governance, because you were talking about the parallel between an Earth System Charter to the Human Rights Charter, and you talked a lot about the Rio Conference in '92, and you mentioned the limits of the international governance, but it seems to me right now that this international governance is necessary to address those questions of justice.
I agree on that. We published in 2009, and when I say we, I mean the German Advisory Council on Global Change. We published a report on the global greenhouse gas budget and how to manage it. We produced this document before the Copenhagen conference in 2009 took place, the climate conference, because our government have been asking us, how would you imagine an ideal climate regime which is efficient from an economic perspective, transparent and plausible in terms of not being too complicated, and just and fair, because many governments from developing countries need to accept this kind of solution. And regarding the plausibility, regarding the justice dimension and the efficiency dimension, we thought that we need to bring this together. And our major idea was that at the end of the day, the only robust justice criterion is emission tradings per capita on an equal basis. So this would imply that we do have 750 gigatons, we do have 7 billion people now, so for each person we do have the same budget. And if you add these individual budgets, you can create national budgets then, national greenhouse gas budgets. And based on that you can start trading those budgets. It is an emission trading scheme on a global scale, but based on global justice. And our major idea was that this would be very efficient, because for high-emitting countries, it would imply an incentive to emit less. For low-emitting countries, it would also be an incentive to emit less, or even less than they had been emitting before, because then they can sell their certificates. So it is economically efficient, but at the same time it is based on this principle on equal per capita rights. And we think that this is the only pattern which developing countries will accept at the end of the day, because it's not plausible to argue that we in Germany are allowed to emit 8 tons and the US are allowed to emit 20 tons, but Africa is only allowed to emit 0.3 tons. No one will accept that. So this is was our idea to bring justice and efficiency together.
Okay. And what about those alliances you talked about? You mentioned doing smaller multilateral alliances. How does this come into this global context and this justice question? Or are the alliances more on the technological side of things? How do you perceive that?
Yeah. The global greenhouse gas budget concept was based on the idea that at the end of the day we should have a global regime, which includes as many as nation states and governments possible, to have a global emission trading schemes. We are all a bit frustrated that this process is not making progress. We are still thinking that we need this kind of global arrangement, and that we need a much higher level of international cooperation to manage these technological dynamics needed and push those, and to manage the justice problems we talked about before also. So international cooperation is needed. Inclusive international cooperation is very important. But as we are making progress on a very slow pattern, and at the same time we are under high time pressure, as we saw on one of these diagrams. The suggestion is that in parallel in terms of building these inclusive multilateral governance systems, in parallel we should start to work together with countries which are anyway going into the same direction, to work together. Investments in technology, investments in training, investments in R&D, so pooling knowledge, know-how and political forces to push the whole international process forward, organizing tipping points in the international system, in the economic one and in the political one. This is the major idea. Okay.
And you were talking just now about the costs and the investments, and I was wondering, this seems to be a very important topic, and I was wondering if you could go over again the reasons why it's important to invest costs in mitigating emissions instead of adapting to the changing climate.
Costs are always very important, because when you start talking to the political decision makers or to investors, people are going to ask you about costs. So you can come up with many normative issues or justice issues. If you do not have a concept which demonstrates the costs of this kind of great transformations, you will never ever be successful. So we need to talk about costs. And what we are demonstrating and what we bring together in terms of information about the cost structures of mitigation strategies and the cost structures of adaptation strategies is that adaptation costs in the future will be much higher, and there is a big consensus on that, than mitigation costs. But we do have a time problem, because we need to make this mitigation investments now. I talked about the next 10 years in which we need to shift our investment paradigms, in which we need to shift our growth and consumption paradigms. So we need these investments now, mitigation investments. The climate crisis and the climate impacts will grow up and emerge in 2030, 2040. So we will need this kind of investments to manage climate crises in 20, 30 years' time. So decision makers in the current situation might decide not to go for mitigation and leave the climate dynamics grow, and the adaptation investments then need to be made in 20, 30 years' time. So the management of this time gap, this is the real challenge.
And you were talking about the different actors and the different roles, and I think when you think of investments, you think a lot about the private sector and the public sector. And this is their role in this framework to do those investments now for later. And what about civil society?
Well, civil society is very important from two perspectives. The first perspective is that civil society might help to make these investments happen, because ordinary people in the streets might have in mind the future of their children. And they might be concerned about the future of their children. And they might ask, therefore, decision makers to invest now to avoid climate crisis. So civil society is very important to organize political dynamics. On the other hand side, civil society actors are also investors. In the German context, in the European context, we see many private individuals investing in energy savings of their buildings, for example. Huge investments. So private actors are not only political citizens, they are also investors, because what we are seeing now is technological options for decentralizing our energy systems. And civil society actors might be very important in this respect also.
Indeed, yeah. And we were talking about technology. There's one term you said that in the learning objectives we should know is a niche. And I have a hinting that the niche has to do with technology, but you didn't really talk about it. So could you explain what a niche is?
The concept of a niche is part of the discussion of innovation economists or evolutionary economists. So people which reflect on how innovations are coming up in societies or in economies. And what they show is that we have been talking about the system of the high carbon economy. No? What they argue is that innovations are always starting in niches. The system is still stable, but several firms, several actors are already thinking towards something completely different. We saw that the debate on sustainability started in the 1970s already with the report on the limits to growth. And the first firms investing in renewable energy started already at the beginning of the 80s, of course being only a minority. So the niche is the starting point where innovations are coming up. And then you need a political framework and incentive structures to scale up this niche innovations. And this is the concept of the niche.
Okay.
You cannot modernize and make this transformation as a whole in the whole system in a given moment in time. It is a process. It's not a revolution, it's a process. And it starts in a niche. And change agents which are driving forward these niche innovations are therefore very important actors which we discuss and analyze in our report.
Okay. You were talking about the drivers and types that allow this, that we can look at to understand the transformation. And one thing I noticed is that many of these drivers and types were taken from examples in the Western world. And if this transformation has to be global, will they also apply in all countries equally? Or do you think there are other things that need to be looked at to further push the transformation?
Yeah. This is a very good question and a very important one. On the one hand side, the sectors we need to focus on are the same. So it is urban, it is energy, it is land use. But on the other hand side, the situations in institutional terms, political terms, are completely different. One thing which is very challenging is that if we go into developing countries, very often the governance capacities are weak. But what we need are strong policy reforms and complex policy reforms. So investing in governance capacities is therefore a very important issue. So what we would need as a follow-up step to this study is to go into different country settings in terms of understanding better how transformations in real contexts in different countries need and can take place. So this is a very important point.
Okay. And you just mentioned land use again, and in your lecture you spent a lot of time talking about energy and urbanization, but not so much about land use. So I was wondering if you could maybe say a few things about why land use is so important, because I think to most people agriculture doesn't seem like something polluting or bad.
Yeah. So I said that 30% of the emissions are coming from land sectors. Half of those, more or less, is deforestation, and the other half is agricultural use of land. So it is an important part of as a source of greenhouse gas emissions. And the question here is how to bring down the greenhouse gas emissions in the agricultural setting. This is about management methods. This is about which kind of chemicals you use. This is about how you organize the process of agricultural production. We know that, and we do have the technologies, and we know where the problems are. And there are two important observations. The first one is that there is a huge consensus actually globally that we need to go into low carbon energy supply. There is a huge debate on timescale, investments, but in general people know about that, and there is a consensus. In terms of the agricultural sector, there is no consensus on how we should organize the agricultural sector, and then from the perspective of mitigation for 9 billion people becoming richer. So there is a need for consensus building. And on the other hand side, there is no technological and economic efficiency progress in the agricultural sector. We do have carbon efficiency gains in the energy sector. We do have carbon efficiency gains in the urban sector. Buildings are becoming more energy efficient as a trend. In the agricultural sector, since the 1990s, during the last 20 years, no progress at all. So a very important sector which we need to focus on.
Okay, and so taking this together, these cultural differences that still need to be researched and these sectors that still need to be further developed, and then looking at this in a global way, you talked about those shifting norms and values. And so it's also shifting norms and values about how to do agriculture, but also talking about it in an intercultural context.
Mm-hmm.
And so my next question is about this process of shifting norms. Does it have to be an individual one, or should it be one directed by states or by some sort of even higher level of governance that would give the direction? How do you see this process happening?
Mm-hmm. Shifting norms.
Yeah.
I would say that shifting norms is something which emerges really in societies. You can't organize a norm shift or a cultural shift as the president of a government. This is absolutely impossible. So shifting norms are linked to shifting perceptions in societies. This then might be embedded in what research and science says about new situations. It might be based on learning processes between different generations, or people observing that different things are organized differently in other countries, so learning processes. But norms and values cannot be implemented by governments. These are really societal processes.
Okay, so I guess they will take more time when you think of the time windows.
Yeah, but what we demonstrate with the data which we are bringing together in the report is that in many countries we are seeing this kind of shifting norms towards sustainability perceptions. And in some countries the discussion is exactly the other way around actually. When I talk to Indian colleagues are saying that you have to shift your norms, we don't have to do that, because in terms of consumption patterns in our food sectors, we are vegetarians already. So we are producing much less emissions in our agricultural system than you are. So you do have an adjustment problem. We don't have this.
Okay. Well, thank you for this optimistic outlook. I had one last question about many times during your lecture you were talking about how people in academia have to talk to policymakers, and you were talking about these theories, and then you were kind of translating them into political actions, or this roadmap for the transformation. And I wanted to ask you, as a political scientist, as a professor, and as someone who works closely to politicians, how is your day-to-day life? How do you do that? How do you marry those two fields?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean the basis of my work is my research. And the science I'm interested in, this is political science and economics. So I'm interested in institutions, in power structures. These are fields where I feel comfortable in. Global governance issues. These are things which I'm bringing into the debates of the German Advisory Council on Global Change. But based on that, then you need, as a political advisor, you need to translate, as you already said, what you have been researching and writing down in journal articles, for example. If you send a journal article to the chancellor or to a minister, he will not have the time to read it. If he would have the time to read it, he probably will not see what kind of impacts your academic findings might have for his or her decision-making processes. So you need to understand well the political processes which are moving forward. You need to understand the mindsets of the decision makers you are working with. And this is an additional step to translate what you have been finding out as research results in concrete policy advice. But another important contribution of the German development of the German Advisory Council on Global Change for political decision makers with regard to our flagships is to try to frame where the problems actually are. and lie. So identify the problems as such. In this report which we are talking about, I think the most important part is to show show and demonstrate the different transformational shifts which we need to have in mind to change the development patterns. So the analytical part is as important as the political instruments which we are talking about then on the last 50 pages or so. So developing a narrative which is analytically well grounded and politically interesting and feasible. This is also a very important contribution of academics to policymaking. Telling interesting narratives is important for organizing this kind of political changes we are talking about.
Thank you. Dear students, I hope you enjoyed the interview and that it answered some of your questions, and we'll see you in the next lecture.
See you.